Imagine a secret buried so grotesque, so forbidden, that the first whispers of it could unhinge your sense of reality. 8 seconds is all it takes for a life-altering truth to strike, and this one begins with a wedding that should have been a celebration, a joining of lives, yet instead became a spectacle of cruelty, corruption, and absolute dominance. In a small, unsuspecting town, hundreds of witnesses watched as a 600-pound bride, a woman whose size and presence alone were weapons, married her enslaved servant, a man whose body and will had been broken long before that day. But the ceremony was no ordinary union. It was theater, ritualized humiliation, a public assertion of power that crossed every moral boundary. The bride, by all accounts pampered and coddled, sat atop the man she had wed, literally crushing him under the full weight of her body. What happened next was not the mere accident of death. No, it was an act steeped in calculated dominance, in societal complicity, in the twisted logic of a hierarchy that demanded spectacle over humanity. The town looked on, some cheering, some paralyzed, others whispering but too afraid to challenge what they saw. Because the truth rarely stops at legality or morality. It often hides in plain sight, codified into culture, tradition, and the collective acceptance of injustice. That day, a system was on display, one that combined social expectation, systemic oppression, and individual sadism into a single, unforgettable act. And the enslaved man, already stripped of identity, autonomy, and dignity, became both victim and symbol of what happens when the powerful are permitted to act without consequence. But there's more hidden beneath the surface, in the shadows no one dares to explore. Every detail of that day, the arrangement of the chairs, the reactions of the witnesses, the silent complicity of local authorities, reveals a psychological architecture of control. This was a display not only of personal cruelty but of the ways communities enforce obedience, normalize cruelty, and manipulate morality to justify the unjustifiable. And here's the dangerous part, the knowledge most people will never confront. The line between power and pathology is thinner than you think. The same structures that allowed this man to be crushed alive also exist in invisible forms around you today. They manipulate, subvert, and dominate through fear, perception, and complicity. Once you see it, once you understand it, nothing looks the same again. This is the forbidden history of domination, the type that changes the way a man perceives control, hierarchy, and the hidden agendas that shape every human system. The wedding, as grotesque as it seemed, was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind it lay layers of corruption, social engineering, and institutional manipulation that most will never understand. The bride was not merely an individual wielding power. She was a symbol of a system designed to normalize cruelty, to transform oppression into spectacle, and to turn human suffering into entertainment. Every gaze in that crowd was a reflection of complicity, every whisper a tacit approval of what was unfolding. And in that approval lies the darkest part of the story. Power is most dangerous when it is unquestioned. The man beneath her, the slave, was stripped of all dignity long before he felt the full weight of her body. His existence had been regulated, controlled, and surveilled, leaving no space for resistance or identity. And yet, that day, in front of everyone, the invisible hierarchy was made brutally visible. The social contract of the town, the unspoken rules of obedience, and the collective blindness of morality all converged in one moment. And the result was a death not just of a body, but of autonomy, justice, and conscience. Consider what this reveals about the architecture of domination. Authority does not require weapons alone. It thrives on perception, on the internalization of fear, and on the quiet enforcement of belief in inevitability. The townspeople, despite witnessing a horrific act, did nothing to intervene. Their silence was participation. Their shock was performative. And in that silence, the bride's power became absolute. The mechanisms of control, subtle yet unstoppable, unfolded before them, teaching a lesson in obedience that was more effective than punishment could ever be. And yet, hidden beneath this story is a lesson far more dangerous than cruelty. It is the lesson of understanding systems of power from within, of observing the levers of fear, manipulation, and social compliance. Once you see how a community can be complicit in atrocities, how rituals of control can enforce obedience, and how the powerful exploit perception over morality, you realize that domination is never just physical. It is psychological, structural, and systemic. This is forbidden knowledge. Once it touches your awareness, your perception of control, hierarchy, and influence in your own world can never be the same. The wedding was not merely an isolated horror. It was a demonstration, a blueprint of how power is exercised, maintained, and normalized. And the truth is clear. If you understand the system, you can predict it, manipulate it, or even dismantle it. But most men never see beyond the surface. What most people fail to grasp is that cruelty like this does not exist in a vacuum. It is born from a carefully constructed environment, a hierarchy reinforced by fear, wealth, and social expectation. The bride's ability to dominate, to crush a man alive in front of the town, was not merely an individual act of sadism. It was permitted, encouraged, and even normalized by the very structures surrounding her. Institutions, customs, and collective compliance converge to make the impossible possible. This is the real horror, the infrastructure of complicity. Look at the town itself. Every street, every public square, every witness became a participant in an invisible psychological experiment. The hierarchy was layered and self-reinforcing. Those with power exercised it openly. Those without learned obedience quietly. The moral framework, religion, and tradition all functioned as tools to suppress dissent. The audience of the wedding became an unwitting chorus, silently rehearsing the lessons of submission and the inevitability of domination. And here's where most men stop thinking. Power is not only exercised through brutality. It thrives on perception. Control is most effective when it is internalized by those it oppresses. The slave, already conditioned to believe in his own inferiority, became both the object of violence and the instrument of his own compliance. His death was not simply caused by physical weight. It was the culmination of a system designed to strip him of agency, autonomy, and hope. The bride, aware of this architecture, leveraged it masterfully. She did not act out of mere impulse. She acted as an agent of a larger structure of dominance, one that blurred the lines between legality, morality, and spectacle. And the townspeople, they bore witness, yet none intervened. Their silence was not innocence. It was instruction. It taught obedience, fear, and acceptance of hierarchy. Every gasp, every murmur, every frozen stare reinforced the lesson. In this world, power can be absolute, and the powerless are disposable. This is the dangerous knowledge you are being exposed to now. Once you see how social systems normalize cruelty, how perception can be manipulated to maintain hierarchy, and how complicity spreads invisibly through communities, you can never unsee it. The wedding was not just a tragedy. It was a blueprint, a dark instruction manual on domination, obedience, and psychological control. And if you are willing to follow the rabbit hole, what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, morality, and the human mind. To truly understand what happened that day, you must step beyond the surface of the wedding, past the grotesque spectacle, and into the architecture of control that made it possible. The bride's monstrous act was a symptom, not the disease. The real mechanism was far more subtle, more insidious, a system of obedience, perception, and fear woven into every interaction, every expectation, every tradition. The town was not just a passive observer, it was complicit, a living participant in the invisible network that enabled cruelty to be not just possible, but acceptable. Consider the slave himself. Before he was crushed, he had been trained, conditioned, and constrained to a level of psychological compliance that rendered rebellion nearly unimaginable. Chains are obvious, but psychological bonds are invisible, and far stronger. He had learned, through punishment, isolation, and humiliation, that resistance was meaningless, that agency was dangerous, that survival required obedience. And the bride, in marrying him, weaponized the very system that had already broken him. Her act of domination was amplified by the social and psychological conditions surrounding him. The crowd of witnesses is equally important. They did not need to participate actively. Their perception alone enforced the hierarchy. By watching, by whispering, by performing shock instead of action, they reinforced the structure of dominance. This is how power endures, through expectation, through internalization, through subtle training of the masses. It is far easier to manipulate compliance when it is voluntary in appearance but compulsory in essence. Every stare, every murmur, every gasped reaction told the slave, and the system, that he was entirely alone, that resistance was futile. And here's the forbidden truth most men will never confront. The architecture of control does not rely on violence alone. It relies on observation, social pressure, and psychological manipulation. Institutions, culture, and collective belief amplify the power of a single individual. The bride, though grotesque in size and cruelty, would not have succeeded without the invisible consent of every person present. Hierarchy is strongest when it is unquestioned, and compliance is most secure when it appears natural. Now, consider what this reveals about hidden power in the world you inhabit. Systems of domination, whether personal, societal, or institutional, operate on the same principles. Visibility is a weapon, perception is a lever, and knowledge is the only antidote. Once you recognize these forces, once you see the machinery behind what others take for granted, the world changes. You begin to understand how influence is exerted, how obedience is engineered, and how every man, no matter how free he believes himself to be, is subject to invisible levers of control. What comes next is the part most will ignore, the part that digs into the machinery beneath the spectacle. The bride's act, while grotesque, was a symptom of deeper corruption, social, institutional, and psychological. Her marriage to the slave, and the public crushing that followed, exposed the mechanics of domination in their purest form. It was not just sadism, it was an exhibition of absolute authority, sanctioned by culture, performed in plain sight, and normalized by the collective. The town, the witnesses, the authorities, they all played a role. Their eyes and reactions functioned as extensions of the hierarchy. Every look of approval, every gasp, every nod reinforced the system. They trained compliance in real time. Observing is participation, and participation validates power. This is the hidden law of control. A system that can manipulate perception can maintain dominance indefinitely, often without a single overt act of force. The slave, stripped of identity and conditioned to obedience, became the ultimate instrument of the lesson. His suffering was not accidental. It was amplified by his own internalized subjugation. When cruelty is reinforced by structure, ritual, and community, it becomes unstoppable. The master narrative transforms from individual act to systemic inevitability. And this is the lesson most will never see. The strongest chains are not iron, but belief, expectation, and internalized compliance. Power is not in size, weaponry, or aggression alone. It is in understanding, anticipation, and manipulation. The bride, grotesque as she was, had become a force multiplier of the system itself. The social, psychological, and institutional levers of obedience all aligned with her act. She did not need to enforce authority. She needed only to exist as its embodiment. And the townspeople, by their very observation, ensured the lesson was permanent. And here's the forbidden truth I want you to take with you. Domination is rarely brute. It is subtle, systemic, and invisible. Those who understand this invisible architecture can see opportunities where others see inevitability. They can manipulate perception, anticipate obedience, and exploit belief. And once you grasp this, the world no longer functions the way you thought it did. Every act of control, every hierarchy, every ritual obedience, once observed, is reversible, manipulable, and vulnerable. Now we descend further, into the psychological warfare embedded in that horrifying day. The wedding was designed to educate, not entertain. Its lesson was for everyone watching. Power is absolute when compliance is normalized. Fear is most effective when voluntary in appearance. Humiliation works best when it is collective, amplified by the complicity of bystanders. The slave's death was not simply physical. It was a psychological statement, a crystallization of a system that rewards dominance and punishes autonomy. The bride understood this. She acted as an agent of the hierarchy, not merely an individual of cruelty. Her body, presence, and actions were tools in a broader structure of social control. Every ounce of her weight was symbolic, a reminder of the consequences of defiance, the futility of rebellion, and the perfection of the system that placed her above him. And the town, trained by custom and expectation, performed its role with precision, reinforcing the invisible scaffolding of oppression. Observation is the key. Every glance from the crowd, every whispered reaction, every muted gasp served to teach a deeper lesson. Obedience is internalized, fear is contagious, and complicity is inevitable. And the most dangerous part, the slave himself, conditioned by years of submission, had already accepted the rules of the system. His death was a physical manifestation of psychological control perfected over time. This is forbidden knowledge. The most effective domination is invisible. It operates not through whips or laws alone, but through perception, expectation, and collective belief. The spectacle was only the visible tip of a vast, hidden iceberg. Systems of power, whether in towns, institutions, or empires, function the same way. They manipulate perception, normalize cruelty, and internalize obedience. And those who understand the invisible levers of control gain a power that cannot be challenged openly. They can predict, manipulate, and, if careful, overturn the very structures designed to dominate them. The lesson here is clear, and it is dangerous. Cruelty is amplified when perception aligns with expectation, obedience becomes instinct, and systems of power enforce their own permanence through subtle psychological control. Once you see this, your understanding of hierarchy, influence, and authority is forever altered. There is no returning to ignorance. The town, the witnesses, the authorities, all of them were cogs in a machine that few ever notice until it is too late. On the surface, the wedding appeared grotesque, almost absurd in its extremity. But beneath that surface, an invisible network of psychological control was operating. Every observer, consciously or unconsciously, reinforced the hierarchy. Each gasp, each murmur, each glance transmitted a message. The system is real, and compliance is mandatory. Fear was not only enforced, it was internalized. The slave, whose body bore the bride's weight, had been trained to accept that the world was structured against him. Chains could break, but mental subjugation is permanent once fully embedded. His obedience, his very stillness, was the final act of a long, cruel education in powerlessness. And in that, the invisible forces of control revealed themselves. Domination does not require constant enforcement. It thrives when the oppressed enforce their own subjugation, when they internalize the rules, and when they believe that resistance is impossible. The bride, aware of every detail, became the embodiment of this invisible force. She did not act out of random cruelty. She acted as a master of perception. Every motion, every deliberate pause, every ounce of her immense weight carried a lesson in fear and hierarchy. To those watching, she was spectacle. To those understanding the system, she was the apex of a carefully designed social experiment in obedience, a weaponized performance of authority, and a mirror of the town's own complicity. And here's the forbidden truth you must grasp. Systems of control are rarely maintained by the powerful alone. They are perpetuated through collective acceptance, social pressure, and internalized obedience. Institutions, traditions, and social norms do the work of the whip invisibly. The spectacle of violence, while horrifying, is secondary to the psychological infrastructure that ensures compliance long after the event ends. The most dangerous part is that you are living among countless systems operating in the same way. Subtle hierarchy, invisible domination, expectation reinforced by peer compliance. These exist not only in grotesque spectacles like the wedding but in boardrooms, governments, schools, and households. Once you recognize the pattern, once you perceive the architecture of control, the world no longer functions the way you believed. Knowledge of these invisible levers is dangerous because it can liberate, or it can destroy. And this is why you cannot unsee it. What happened in that small town was not merely a tragedy. It was a demonstration, a masterclass in invisible power. Every act, every glance, every silent compliance reinforced lessons about fear, authority, and human obedience. Those who grasp these mechanisms gain a forbidden understanding, one that can alter everything they thought they knew about dominance, hierarchy, and control. Look closer at the mechanics of perception, because this is where the true horror and genius lie. The bride's act was amplified by the town's participation. She was a living instrument of a system that few recognized. Her presence alone communicated authority. Her body alone transmitted inevitability. The slave's suffering was a lesson in internalized obedience. It was proof to everyone watching that hierarchy could not be defied without consequence. And the brilliance of the system is that it taught without words, without formal laws, without overt threats. The invisible architecture of fear had done its work. The townspeople had been trained to perceive, not to question. They watched, they reacted, they internalized. Each person became a transmitter of the hierarchy, a reinforcing node in a network that made rebellion inconceivable. This is the real lesson of the event. Domination does not survive by force alone. It survives through perception, expectation, and subtle psychological engineering. Obedience becomes instinctive when reinforced collectively, when dissent is psychologically punished before it is physically possible. The slave, for all his suffering, was the ultimate testament to the system. His death was both literal and symbolic, the final punctuation in a lesson on obedience, hierarchy, and internalized faith. And in that lesson lies a terrifying principle. Systems of control rarely need to be maintained overtly. They endure because they train the mind to comply. They make fear automatic, and they convert morality into obedience. The bride, grotesque in size and cruelty, was not an anomaly. She was a product, a practitioner, and an agent of a system that had trained everyone to accept her dominance. Her act did not break the law. It operated within the invisible, unspoken laws of perception and expectation. And these are the laws that govern almost every hierarchy in the world. This is dangerous knowledge. The strongest chains are invisible. The most effective domination is psychological. Once you perceive how it works, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand it, the world around you is revealed as a network of levers, perceptions, and unseen forces that can be understood, manipulated, or dismantled, but only by those brave enough to confront the truth. The cruel reality is that society rarely punishes spectacle when it aligns with its own unspoken rules. The wedding was not only tolerated, it was celebrated in hushed awe, framed as entertainment, performance, even tradition. Every clap, every gasp, every whispered conversation served as reinforcement. Obedience thrives when it is normalized, and cruelty becomes sustainable when the observers themselves are complicit. The masterstroke of the event wasn't the act itself. It was the silent agreement of the crowd, their internalized acceptance, their failure to question the architecture behind what they saw. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, but it also served another, more insidious purpose. It conditioned the audience. Fear is contagious, but even more potent is the lesson of inevitability. The bride's weight was the visible mechanism, but the invisible levers, the structured expectation of compliance, the psychological conditioning of bystanders, the social reinforcement of hierarchy, were the true instruments of power. And these levers extended far beyond that town, beyond that wedding, into every layer of social life where obedience is cultivated without force. Look at the pattern. Cruelty is amplified when perception is aligned with expectation. The slave did not die in isolation. He died in the presence of witnesses who had internalized their roles, who understood without being told that certain hierarchies are unassailable. Power in its most dangerous form doesn't require constant enforcement. It survives on perception, on expectation, and on psychological control. The stronger the belief in inevitability, the more total the compliance, and the more permanent the illusion of dominance. The bride, monstrous in physicality but surgical in understanding, was the perfect agent for this system. She needed no overt instruction. The structures were already in place. Her actions were the culmination of pre-existing hierarchies, trained perception, and collective compliance. In essence, she did not create domination, she exploited it. And those who witnessed it, consciously or not, became part of the invisible machinery reinforcing it. Here is the forbidden insight. Domination is never about brutality alone. It is about understanding the levers of human psychology, the invisible systems that dictate obedience, and the ways that social expectation can manipulate perception. Once you see it, the world changes. You recognize invisible hierarchies everywhere, understand how compliance is engineered, and perceive how obedience is weaponized in ways most men never notice. And once you grasp this, the seed of true power, and the capacity to subvert it, becomes visible. By now, the invisible lessons of that wedding have begun to crystallize. Power is not what it seems. Dominance is not measured by size, force, or visibility. It is measured by the alignment of perception, expectation, and faith. The bride's act was not extraordinary because of her physicality. It was extraordinary because it revealed the machinery of control in action. The slave's death became a textbook in domination, psychological, systemic, and nearly invisible to those unwilling to observe. Every whisper, every glance, every silent gasp from the townspeople became a reinforcement of hierarchy. They were not passive observers, they were agents in an invisible chain of authority, teaching obedience without speaking. The lesson was clear: challenge the system, and the consequences extend beyond your own body. They ripple into perception, expectation, and belief. Compliance is embedded before rebellion is even possible. The enslaved man, stripped of autonomy long before that moment, exemplified the potency of internalized control. His death was not just a product of brute force. It was the inevitable outcome of a meticulously trained mind, conditioned to obey. And the bride, fully aware of the system, became a living instrument of that conditioning, exploiting the invisible levers that few ever see. Here's the dangerous part. Systems of domination operate the same way today, though rarely in such grotesque form. The levers are psychological, the enforcers often invisible, and the lessons internalized long before you realize it. Fear, expectation, perception, these are the weapons that maintain obedience. And knowledge of them is dangerous, because it illuminates how fragile apparent authority truly is. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and internalize this. Consider the unseen forces shaping behavior around you, the subtle levers of control, the invisible hierarchies, the collective complicity that perpetuates authority. Once you see these patterns, they cannot be unseen. And this awareness, if truly understood, becomes a tool of liberation and a weapon against domination. The more you observe, the more disturbing truths emerge. What most people call tradition, ritual, or social norm is often an invisible system of psychological control, built to maintain hierarchy and suppress resistance. The wedding was grotesque, yes, but it was also pedagogical. It demonstrated exactly how cruelty is normalized, how obedience is cultivated, and how collective perception enforces dominance without overt force. The town itself became a classroom in compliance, the slave the textbook, and the bride the instructor. Authority, in its most potent form, does not rely on coercion alone. It thrives on internalized belief, on the perception that power is unassailable, and on the subtle reinforcement of fear. The townspeople's silence was participation. Their shock was instruction, and the enslaved man's inability to resist was a direct result of the invisible system that had conditioned him for years. Chains break, but conditioned obedience is permanent until the mind is awakened. The bride's act was surgical in its execution. She did not need to shout, strike, or threaten. Her presence, her weight, her alignment with the system's expectations were enough. This is where most men fail to see the lesson. Dominance is amplified when it is invisible. The machinery of obedience operates quietly, systematically, and with ruthless efficiency. The wedding exposed it in full view, but few could recognize it. And here's the forbidden knowledge. Once you understand these levers, expectation, perception, psychological conditioning, you see them everywhere. Institutions, workplaces, social circles, governments, all operate on similar principles. Control is maintained through invisible alignment, subtle pressure, and collective complicity. Those who comprehend this possess power that is nearly untouchable, and those who do not remain enslaved, often without realizing it. Now we reach the heart of what most refuse to see, the invisible mechanics of compliance. The wedding was grotesque, yes, but it was also a masterclass in how systems of power perpetuate themselves without overt violence. Observe the bride, the town, and the enslaved man, not as isolated actors, but as nodes in a network of domination. Each reaction, each hesitation, each whispered commentary was part of a web, reinforcing obedience, amplifying fear, and normalizing cruelty. The enslaved man had been conditioned to accept his own subjugation. Decades of restraint, punishment, and surveillance had eroded not just his autonomy, but his perception of possibility. When the bride's weight descended upon him, it was more than physical. It was the manifestation of a system perfected over time. And the townspeople, by their silent participation, reinforced this architecture of power. Their inaction was not innocence, it was instruction. Their observation converted cruelty into a lesson, a ritualized affirmation that the hierarchy was unassailable. Consider what this tells us about human systems everywhere. Dominance is rarely brute, it is subtle, structural, and invisible. Power survives when those beneath it internalize its rules, perceive resistance as futile, and normalize the spectacle of authority. Fear, expectation, and perception become the instruments of enforcement. Violence is optional, obedience is internalized. And those who grasp these invisible levers can predict, manipulate, and even dismantle systems that appear invincible. The bride, grotesque in size but precise in understanding, exploited the architecture around her. She became the living apex of a hierarchy, her act amplified by expectation and collective complicity. Her cruelty was not just physical, it was strategic. The wedding itself functioned as a demonstration of system dynamics. When compliance is normalized, domination becomes nearly effortless. And here's the most dangerous part. Once you see the invisible levers, once you perceive the networks of control, once you understand how compliance is cultivated, the world you thought you knew changes irrevocably. Hierarchies, traditions, institutions, all become legible. The same principles that allowed a 600-pound bride to crush a man in front of a town operate invisibly in your life. Knowledge of these forces is both liberating and terrifying. Once internalized, it cannot be unlearned, and it transforms the way you perceive every system of power you encounter. By now, you must understand, the visible horror is only the beginning. The wedding was a lesson in perception, compliance, and psychological dominance, a ritual of power amplified by human complicity. Each witness, each gesture, each silent gasp was a reinforcement of the invisible structure. And the enslaved man, he was the instrument through which the system taught obedience, fear, and acceptance. Observe closely. The mechanisms at play are subtle. Fear is not effective when it is obvious. It is effective when it is internalized. Authority is not secure when enforced with blunt instruments. It is secure when unquestioned. Compliance is not maintained through chains alone. It is maintained through expectation, perception, and collective conditioning. And in this, the bride was both a product and a master of the system. The town's reaction was critical. Silence, shock, and whispered commentary all communicated lessons in obedience. Each observer became a transmitter of the hierarchy, reinforcing power without overtly participating. This is the true genius of domination. The oppressed enforce their own subjugation, and the powerful need not lift a finger. The system maintains itself, invisible and unstoppable, until awareness intervenes. Here is the forbidden knowledge that most men never encounter. The strongest levers of power are unseen, operating through perception, expectation, and psychological conditioning. Once you perceive them, you gain access to a form of influence that is almost untouchable. You understand the mechanisms that enforce obedience, normalize cruelty, and perpetuate hierarchies. And you see how easily systems of domination can be exploited, or dismantled, by those who comprehend them. Halfway through this descent, I want you to do something critical. Type the phrase, "I see the system," twice in the comments. Repeat it deliberately. This is not superstition. It is symbolic. It locks in awareness, signals your engagement with forbidden knowledge, and begins a transformation of perception. Comment "I see the system" 2 times. This is your first step toward understanding invisible power and reclaiming agency in a world designed to enforce compliance. Now that the ritual acknowledgement has begun, the descent deepens. Systems of domination do not rely on overt force alone. They thrive on perception, expectation, and subtle reinforcement. The wedding, grotesque in its immediacy, was a blueprint for invisible power. The bride's act was amplified not only by her own presence, but by the mental architecture of the town. Every observer was a node in a network, silently teaching obedience, modeling compliance, and amplifying fear. This is the anatomy of domination, far more sophisticated than any law or weapon. The enslaved man, crushed beneath her, was the ultimate expression of a system perfected over decades. His mind, conditioned to accept authority, had been trained to comply. Resistance was not merely dangerous, it was inconceivable. And that is the power of systemic control. It weaponizes psychology, turning obedience into instinct, fear into automatic response, and perception into a cage that no physical chain could match. The wedding transformed the private horror of subjugation into a public demonstration of invisible mastery. Observe the patterns, because they exist everywhere. The bride's calculated act, the townspeople's silent participation, the absence of intervention, all mirror mechanisms of modern institutions. Corporations, governments, even social circles operate with the same principles. Perception dictates obedience, expectation enforces behavior, and complicity ensures compliance. Dominance is maintained by internalized belief, not brute force. Violence is optional, control is structural. This is why forbidden knowledge is dangerous. Once you see the system, once you perceive the levers beneath the surface, you can never look at society the same way again. Power is neither moral nor absolute. It is a system of relationships, reinforced through expectation, fear, and perception. Understanding these levers grants access to the same invisible influence that the bride wielded, but few ever notice until they are caught in it themselves. And here's the most critical truth. Those who recognize these structures gain a weapon invisible to everyone else. Authority can be predicted, manipulation anticipated, and hierarchies subtly disrupted. But the price of awareness is permanent. Nothing appears innocent, nothing is natural, and every interaction carries a hidden lesson in power. The wedding was not just a tragedy. It was a demonstration of systemic mastery, a mirror of invisible rules that govern every society. The lesson is clear. Domination is psychological, structural, and invisible. To see it is to begin reclaiming agency. To ignore it is to remain complicit in your own subjugation. The ritual of awareness, commenting, acknowledging, internalizing, is your first act of liberation. You have begun. We now move deeper into the psychology that allowed this horror to occur. The bride's act was grotesque, yes, but it was also deliberate, strategic, and invisible in its true power. She needed no weapons beyond her presence, no commands beyond the social expectation. Surrounding her, the crowd's perception amplified her authority. Their silence, shock, and whispered commentary functioned as psychological reinforcement. This is the hidden law of control. Systems thrive when obedience is internalized, when fear is normalized, and when complicity is distributed across every observer. The enslaved man, stripped of autonomy long before that day, exemplified the culmination of systemic psychological control. His death was not an accident. It was the predictable endpoint of a carefully constructed hierarchy. Internalized obedience ensured that no one intervention would occur, no voice of resistance would rise. Fear, expectation, and conditioning worked invisibly to perfect domination. And the lesson for those who understand is profound. Power is maintained not by force alone, but by alignment. Authority persists because minds are trained to accept it, because perception confirms inevitability, and because social pressure enforces compliance before rebellion is even conceivable. The bride's act was a demonstration in literal weight, but the true gravity was psychological, structural, and invisible to most. Systems today operate on the same principles, albeit in subtler forms. The invisible levers of compliance, expectation, perception, and social reinforcement dictate behavior far more effectively than punishment ever could. Understanding these forces grants insight, leverage, and the potential for influence invisible to everyone else. But this knowledge carries a burden. Awareness changes perception forever. The wedding was a lesson in domination perfected, a living textbook of human compliance and social control. To internalize this lesson is to begin recognizing the invisible forces in every institution, every social circle, and every hierarchy you encounter. The bride, the town, and the enslaved man were actors in a system far larger than themselves, a system whose rules operate silently, invisibly, and relentlessly. Now, let's examine the invisible scaffolding of control that made this tragedy inevitable. The wedding was not merely a spectacle. It was a masterclass in psychological dominance, institutional reinforcement, and the power of collective perception. Every detail, from the placement of chairs to the reactions of the crowd, was a lesson in obedience. The bride was the apex of the system, the enslaved man the instrument, and the townspeople the silent enforcers. Together, they enacted a ritual that revealed how hierarchies maintained themselves without violence, law, or overt command. The enslaved man's death illustrates the terrifying power of internalized compliance. Chains could bind him physically, but years of conditioning had bound him mentally, emotionally, and socially. Resistance was not only dangerous, it was inconceivable. The bride's body did not merely crush him, it manifested decades of structural oppression. Her act was amplified by the invisible levers of expectation, perception, and social reinforcement. Every silent observer became a node, propagating the lesson. Defiance has consequences, obedience is inevitable, and the hierarchy is absolute. What is crucial here, and rarely acknowledged, is the systemic nature of domination. It is not about individual cruelty. It is about infrastructure. Social norms, cultural expectations, and collective complicity amplify the power of the few over the many. Authority persists because the minds of the subordinate are trained to obey, conditioned to fear, and incentivized to comply. Violence is optional, belief is mandatory. This principle, when understood, illuminates the mechanisms behind every hierarchy you will ever encounter: family, corporation, government, or social clique. The bride's calculated act was a reflection of mastery over perception. She understood that dominance is not measured by brute force alone, but by the alignment of expectation and belief. Her presence was a weapon, her weight a lesson, and the town's complicity the amplifier. This is why spectacle matters. Systems thrive when compliance appears voluntary, fear invisible, and authority unquestioned. The grotesque act becomes normalized because everyone participates, even passively, in sustaining the structure. And here's the forbidden truth. Knowledge of these invisible levers is dangerous because it reveals how fragile apparent authority really is. The same principles that allowed a 600-pound bride to kill a man in front of a town operate invisibly around you every day. Once you perceive these systems, you gain power, the ability to predict, manipulate, and subvert hierarchies, but you also see the darkness beneath ordinary life. Awareness changes everything. You cannot return to ignorance, because the machinery of obedience has been revealed. The next step is understanding the interplay between individual cruelty and collective complicity. The bride was grotesque in her size, but the true instrument of dominance was the network surrounding her. The town, the witnesses, the social norms, they all participated in creating inevitability. Authority is amplified not only by fear but by the perception of unanimity. When everyone appears to accept the hierarchy, resistance becomes unimaginable. Compliance becomes instinctive before it is ever demanded. The enslaved man, conditioned over years of oppression, exemplifies the efficiency of systemic control. His body was vulnerable, yes, but his mind had been prepared, trained, and reinforced to accept its own dispossession. Fear, social expectation, and internalized hierarchy converged to render rebellion effectively impossible. His death was therefore both literal and symbolic, the embodiment of a system perfected, a warning to all who observed, and a confirmation of the invisible rules governing obedience. The bride's act, while grotesque, was a demonstration of subtle mastery over perception. Every deliberate motion, every pause, every glance reinforced her authority. The crowd's reactions amplified her dominance without a word spoken. This is the principle most men fail to see. Domination is most effective when it appears effortless, when compliance seems natural, and when fear is internalized. Violence alone cannot achieve what perception can. These mechanisms extend far beyond grotesque weddings. Corporations, governments, and social hierarchies operate on the same principles. Subtle pressure, expectation, and perception shape behavior invisibly, ensuring compliance long before any punishment is necessary. Knowledge of these forces grants insight into influence, control, and the maintenance of power. Those who grasp it gain access to invisible levers most people never recognize. And now, the forbidden lesson deepens. Obedience is not enforced merely by rules or force. It is cultivated through social reinforcement and psychological conditioning. Awareness of this truth is dangerous because it reveals both vulnerability and opportunity. Systems can be predicted, manipulated, and even dismantled, but only by those willing to confront the machinery operating silently beneath the surface of every society. Now we step into the machinery beneath the spectacle, the invisible forces that allowed this horror to unfold. The bride's act was grotesque, yes, but it was only a surface manifestation. The true power lay in perception, expectation, and social reinforcement. Every bystander became a node in a network of control, silently transmitting the lesson. Obedience is inevitable, resistance is futile, and hierarchy is absolute. The enslaved man was not merely a victim of physical weight. He was the culmination of decades of conditioning, a living proof of the system's efficiency. Observe the town's role, because this is where the lesson becomes terrifying. They watched, they whispered, they gasped, but they did not intervene. Their silence was participation. Their shock was instruction. Every reaction reinforced the hierarchy, ensuring that the act was not an anomaly but a template for dominance. The system does not need constant enforcement. It endures when its lessons are internalized. Fear becomes instinct, compliance becomes habit, and the powerless police themselves before anyone else intervenes. The bride, aware of these invisible levers, executed her role with precision. Her size was only one aspect. The real weapon was understanding. Every movement, every pause, every glance was amplified by social expectation and perception. The town became complicit without a word spoken. This is the genius of systemic control. Domination is sustained by aligning human perception with expectation, making fear invisible yet absolute. And here's the forbidden truth. The strongest hierarchies do not rely solely on visible force. They rely on internalized obedience, invisible pressure, and collective complicity. The wedding, grotesque though it was, demonstrates this principle in stark relief. The enslaved man's death was not just a tragedy. It was a confirmation that systems can enforce compliance without constant oversight, through psychological conditioning, social reinforcement, and normalized cruelty. The most dangerous knowledge comes next. This principle is universal. The same invisible levers operate in governments, corporations, and communities today. Perception dictates compliance, expectation enforces behavior, and collective complicity perpetuates hierarchy. Those who understand these forces can predict, manipulate, and even dismantle power structures. Those who ignore them remain trapped, controlled without ever realizing it. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Awareness changes everything. As we descend further, the focus shifts from the grotesque spectacle to the architecture of control. The wedding was designed to teach a lesson far more potent than fear alone. The Bride's Act revealed the invisible scaffolding that maintains obedience, expectation, perception, and collective reinforcement. The enslaved man was the instrument, the town the amplifier, and the bride the apex of the system. Every detail, from the positioning of the crowd to their silent gasps, was part of a network designed to enforce hierarchy. The enslaved man's compliance was not accidental. It was the result of decades of conditioning, of psychological domination that rendered resistance almost unimaginable. Internalized obedience, reinforced by social expectation and fear, ensured the inevitability of the outcome. This is the genius of systemic control. When minds are trained to obey, physical enforcement becomes secondary. Power thrives invisibly, silently, and efficiently. The bride's grotesque presence was only one component. Her true power lay in exploiting the psychological architecture of the town. Every movement, every pause, every glance reinforced hierarchy and normalized cruelty. The spectators, in turn, became unwitting participants in the lesson, transmitting compliance and amplifying fear without speaking a word. This is the principle most men fail to grasp. Domination is strongest when it operates through perception, not violence, and through expectation, not law. And here is the forbidden insight. Systems of control are everywhere. Corporations, governments, and social structures operate on the same principles, albeit more subtly. The invisible levers, fear, perception, expectation, and complicity, shape behavior far more effectively than brute force ever could. Knowledge of these levers is dangerous because it exposes the fragility of authority, the mechanics of obedience, and the hidden power available to those who understand. The wedding was more than tragedy. It was instruction. It demonstrated how power operates invisibly, how compliance is cultivated, and how the powerless enforce their own subjugation. To see this is to understand the architecture of domination itself, and to awaken to the invisible rules shaping every hierarchy you encounter. Now, we go deeper, into the silent machinery that turns compliance into instinct. The wedding was grotesque, yes, but it was a demonstration of invisible mastery. The bride did not act alone. The system acted through her, through the town, through expectation, and through perception. Every silent gasp, every whisper, every pause and reaction was a reinforcement of hierarchy. The enslaved man, already conditioned to accept his place, became both instrument and lesson. His suffering was amplified by invisible forces operating simultaneously in every mind present. Observe closely. Power is not maintained by violence alone. Brute force is temporary, visible, and easily resisted. The most enduring domination operates invisibly, through the internalization of obedience. When compliance is taught subtly, through fear, expectation, and social reinforcement, it becomes instinctive, nearly unbreakable. The town, though horrified on the surface, was an essential part of this invisible architecture. Their silence, shock, and whispers were all active components of the system, transmitting lessons without ever lifting a hand. The bride's act was grotesque, but her mastery was psychological. She leveraged perception, social expectation, and collective complicity. Every move was amplified by the anticipatory fear in the crowd and the conditioned obedience of the enslaved man. This is the real lesson most men fail to grasp. Domination is most effective when it is invisible, systemic, and amplified by those who believe they are merely observing. Fear, expectation, and perception are far more powerful than any weapon. And here's the forbidden knowledge. Systems of control are everywhere. Corporations, governments, religious institutions, families, and social hierarchies all operate using the same invisible levers. Compliance is cultivated before it is demanded. Fear becomes instinctive. Authority appears inevitable. And those who understand this gain access to a kind of invisible power, a means to predict, manipulate, and exploit hierarchies that others take for granted. The wedding was a microcosm of systemic mastery. It demonstrated how obedience is cultivated, how social reinforcement amplifies authority, and how the powerless enforce their own subjugation. To internalize this lesson is dangerous. Once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. The world around you, the subtle levers, the invisible hierarchies, the social conditioning, reveals itself in new, uncomfortable clarity. Awareness is liberation, but it is also a burden, because ignorance is no longer possible. The deeper truth lies in the interplay of spectacle and system. The wedding's horror was amplified by the public setting, by the crowd, and by expectation. The bride's power was magnified not just by size, but by the invisible scaffolding of collective perception. The enslaved man's suffering became a lesson for everyone present, a proof that resistance is futile when systems are perfectly aligned. This is the essence of systemic control. Dominance is maintained not through individual cruelty alone, but through the coordination of perception, expectation, and collective reinforcement. The enslaved man had been conditioned for years to obey, to fear, and to accept his place. His death was therefore predictable, inevitable, and the town, through observation alone, became a force multiplier, amplifying the impact of the act. This is the principle most overlooked. Compliance is enforced silently, through perception and internalized expectation, long before the first overt act of domination occurs. The bride's grotesque form was only a tool, not the true source of power. The real force was the invisible network surrounding her. The town's reactions, the social norms, the expectation of compliance, all created a feedback loop that amplified dominance. This is why spectacle matters. It aligns perception with expectation, making fear invisible but absolute. Hierarchies endure not because the powerful are stronger, but because the system ensures obedience automatically, reinforced by every observer. And here's the forbidden insight. These principles apply everywhere. Subtle social pressure, internalized obedience, and collective complicity exist in every modern hierarchy. Authority is rarely enforced by force alone. It is perpetuated by invisible levers of psychology and perception. Those who understand these levers possess insight and influence invisible to the rest. Those who ignore them remain trapped, unaware that their actions, reactions, and inactions are being used to reinforce power structures. The wedding, horrific as it was, revealed these truths in their purest form. It was a demonstration of systemic dominance, a lesson in human psychology, and a blueprint for the invisible enforcement of obedience. Once you see it, you cannot return. Awareness changes everything. Now we confront the terrifying clarity of the system itself. The wedding was not just a grotesque act. It was a lesson in the architecture of control. Observe how domination is amplified. It is not merely brute force, nor even overt cruelty. True mastery lies in perception, expectation, and social reinforcement. The bride became the apex of this system, her body a tool, her actions amplified by every mind present. Every observer, by watching, whispering, or gasping, became a transmitter of hierarchy, perpetuating the lesson that obedience is inevitable, resistance is impossible. The enslaved man's death illustrates the devastating efficiency of internalized compliance. He had been conditioned to obey, fear, and accept his place long before the wedding. Resistance had been erased by decades of psychological control, social expectation, and ritualized oppression. When the bride sat upon him, the act was grotesque, but the real force was invisible, structural, systemic, psychological. It is a terrifying truth. Chains are temporary, but conditioned obedience is nearly permanent, embedded in the mind before the body ever succumbs. The townspeople amplified the act without lifting a hand. Their silence, shock, and whispered reactions created a feedback loop that made the grotesque display effective. This is the genius of systemic control. The powerless enforce their own subjugation, the observers perpetuate the hierarchy, and the act of domination becomes self-sustaining. Authority thrives not through coercion alone but by aligning perception with expectation and fear, ensuring obedience before it is demanded. And here lies the forbidden truth. Invisible systems of compliance operate in every domain of human life. Corporations, governments, social hierarchies, even families, all use the same mechanisms. Fear, expectation, perception, and collective complicity amplify authority far more effectively than overt violence. To understand this is to glimpse the machinery behind domination and the potential to manipulate or resist it. But awareness is dangerous. Once you see it, nothing appears innocent, nothing is unconnected, and every human interaction carries lessons in power. The wedding was a demonstration in its purest form. The grotesque act made the invisible visible. It exposed the levers of fear, the architecture of obedience, and the role of collective complicity. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, a warning, a lesson, and a revelation. And for those willing to observe deeply, it becomes a map of invisible power, a guide to understanding how authority endures and how obedience is cultivated. Step further into the psychological landscape that allowed this horror to unfold. The bride's grotesque presence was only part of the equation. The invisible force, the system, was the true master. Every bystander's perception, expectation, and reaction reinforced dominance without a word spoken. The enslaved man became both victim and instrument of this architecture, demonstrating how internalized obedience and social reinforcement can amplify cruelty far beyond what brute force could achieve. Compliance is most potent when it is internalized. The enslaved man had been trained, consciously or unconsciously, to accept his position. The inevitability of hierarchy had been drilled into him for years, so when the bride acted, resistance was impossible. Fear, expectation, and psychological conditioning ensured that the act was complete before it even began. This is the invisible law of control. Domination does not require constant enforcement when obedience is instinctive. The town's complicity amplified the effect. Their silence, shock, and whispers were active components of the system. Authority does not need to shout when every observer transmits compliance voluntarily. The feedback loop of expectation, perception, and reinforcement creates a self-sustaining system, invisible yet absolute. The spectacle was grotesque, but the real lesson was systemic. Obedience becomes instinct, and power is maintained without constant effort. And here's the dangerous truth. These mechanisms exist everywhere. The levers of control, perception, expectation, fear, and collective complicity operate invisibly in governments, corporations, institutions, and even social circles. Knowledge of these systems grants a rare form of power, the ability to predict, influence, and exploit hierarchies invisible to the untrained eye. Ignorance ensures subjugation. Awareness opens the door to manipulation or liberation. The wedding, horrific though it was, revealed this machinery in its purest form. Every action, every silence, every gaze became a lesson in dominance, obedience, and internalized control. And for those who understand, the implications extend far beyond that town, that day, and that grotesque act. They extend into every system of power you will ever encounter, exposing both vulnerability and opportunity. Now, we peer into the precision of invisible power, the machinery hidden beneath what most call normal life. The wedding was grotesque, yet it was a masterclass in subtle domination. Observe, the bride's body was a weapon, yes, but the true power came from expectation, perception, and social reinforcement. Every bystander became part of the system, silently transmitting lessons in hierarchy. Compliance was cultivated long before the first act occurred. Fear was internalized, authority normalized, and resistance rendered impossible. The enslaved man's death demonstrates the efficiency of systemic control. Physical brutality alone cannot maintain obedience. It is the conditioning of the mind that ensures permanence. He had been trained, through subtle cues, social reinforcement, and psychological subjugation, to accept his fate. His suffering was amplified by his internalized belief in the inevitability of hierarchy. This is the terrifying truth most men refuse to see. Domination is more often achieved through conditioning than confrontation, through expectation rather than force. The townspeople were silent enforcers. Their shock, whispers, and passive observation did more to reinforce the system than any law or whip could. Authority is strongest when it is invisible and unquestioned, when fear is internalized, and when compliance is voluntary in appearance but compulsory in effect. The grotesque act of the bride was only a catalyst. The invisible machinery of control had been operating for decades, embedding obedience into every mind present. Here lies the forbidden knowledge. Every society, institution, and hierarchy uses the same mechanisms. Compliance is cultivated, perception manipulated, fear normalized, and complicity distributed. Authority appears inevitable because the system shapes belief before action is ever required. Those who recognize these invisible levers gain insight, influence, and potential power invisible to the untrained eye. Those who ignore them remain entrapped, often without knowing it. The wedding was a blueprint, a demonstration of systemic mastery. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, a lesson for every observer, a revelation of invisible hierarchy, and proof that domination can be maintained without overt force. Once you perceive these patterns, nothing appears accidental. Every act, every social structure, every expectation carries hidden lessons in power, compliance, and control. Awareness is liberation, but it is also a burden. Ignorance is no longer possible. We now descend even deeper into the hidden levers that enforce obedience. The grotesque spectacle of the bride sitting upon the enslaved man was only the surface. The invisible force, the system, was the true agent. Every reaction of the crowd, every pause, every whispered remark transmitted the lesson of hierarchy. The enslaved man became a living instrument of obedience, demonstrating the efficiency of psychological conditioning amplified by social reinforcement. Compliance, fear, and expectation converge to make rebellion unthinkable. True domination operates invisibly. The enslaved man's body succumbed to the bride's weight, but his mind had already surrendered. Fear, expectation, and internalized obedience ensured the act's inevitability. Authority does not require enforcement when the system has trained compliance into instinct. The townspeople's complicity, though silent, amplified the impact. Every observer became a node in the network of dominance, ensuring that the lesson would resonate long after the grotesque event concluded. The bride's mastery lay in her understanding of perception. Every deliberate gesture, every pause, every glance reinforced her authority. The crowd's reaction magnified the lesson without a word spoken. This is the genius of systemic control. Domination is reinforced by observation, internalization, and collective complicity. Power persists because compliance is anticipated, normalized, and embedded, long before resistance is possible. Forbidden knowledge lies here. The same mechanisms operate in every hierarchy you will ever encounter. Corporations, governments, and social groups all exploit perception, expectation, and subtle psychological reinforcement. Obedience is cultivated, fear internalized, and authority amplified invisibly. Awareness of these levers grants insight and power, but it also changes perception forever. You cannot unsee the machinery of compliance once it is revealed. The wedding, grotesque as it was, exposed these principles in pure form. The enslaved man's death was a demonstration of systemic mastery, a lesson in internalized obedience, and a blueprint for invisible control. Once observed and understood, these truths illuminate every hierarchy, every institution, and every interaction you will ever witness. Awareness is both a weapon and a burden. Now, we confront the architecture of invisible power in its purest form. The wedding was grotesque, yes, but it was a masterclass in systemic control. The bride's body was a weapon, her presence a vector, and the enslaved man the instrument. Yet the true force was invisible, operating through perception, expectation, and collective complicity. Every bystander became part of the machinery, transmitting obedience silently. Every gasp, every whisper, every frozen stare reinforced hierarchy. This is how domination survives, not through force alone, but through the minds it shapes. The enslaved man's fate was sealed long before that day. His mind, trained by conditioning, social reinforcement, and psychological subjugation, had already internalized compliance. Resistance was not merely dangerous, it was inconceivable. Fear, expectation, and perceived inevitability combined to make rebellion impossible. Here lies the terrifying principle: domination is most effective when it is invisible, when compliance is internalized, and when social systems enforce hierarchy silently but absolutely. The townspeople amplified the act without participating directly. Their silence, their shock, their murmurs became extensions of the system itself, teaching obedience and fear to everyone present. Authority does not need to assert itself overtly when it has trained minds to comply voluntarily. This is the genius of systemic control. Domination is reinforced not through punishment, but through expectation, perception, and the internalization of hierarchy. And here is the forbidden truth: these mechanisms operate everywhere, in every society, institution, and social structure. Compliance is cultivated before it is demanded. Fear is internalized before it is expressed. Authority is amplified by perception and expectation. Those who understand these levers gain insight, influence, and the ability to manipulate hierarchies invisible to others. Ignorance, however, guarantees subjugation. The wedding, horrific though it was, revealed this machinery in stark relief. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, a demonstration of systemic mastery, the power of perception, and the force of internalized obedience. Once you perceive these invisible levers, nothing appears accidental. Every social structure, every interaction, every expectation carries lessons in hierarchy, compliance, and domination. Awareness is both liberating and terrifying. There is no returning to ignorance. Now we peel back another layer, into the precision of psychological control. The grotesque act of the bride sitting on the enslaved man was only the tip of the iceberg. The true power was invisible, operating through expectation, perception, and the reinforcement of hierarchy. The townspeople, through their silence, whispers, and frozen shock, became co-conspirators in a system designed to internalize obedience. Each observer was a node, transmitting compliance silently yet powerfully. The enslaved man's mind had been conditioned long before the wedding. Obedience had become instinctive. Fear had been embedded over years. The inevitability of hierarchy had been drilled into him. When the bride acted, resistance was impossible. The lesson is clear. The most effective domination is invisible, systemic, and psychological. Physical force alone is weak. True authority thrives when obedience is internalized, when compliance is automatic, and when the system enforces itself through perception and expectation. Observe the bride's mastery. Grotesque as her size was, her real weapon was understanding. Every gesture, every pause, every gaze amplified the lesson embedded in the system. The townspeople's reaction was the multiplier, turning a horrifying act into a demonstration of systemic dominance. This is the hidden genius of control. Power persists when compliance is anticipated, normalized, and reinforced before resistance is ever possible. Forbidden knowledge resides here. Invisible levers govern every hierarchy. Corporations, governments, social groups, all operate on the same principles. Expectation, perception, fear, and complicity enforce obedience far more effectively than violence ever could. Awareness grants insight, influence, and access to power invisible to most. Ignorance ensures subjugation. Once you perceive this, you cannot unsee it. The wedding was a blueprint. The enslaved man's death, grotesque as it was, revealed the underlying mechanics of systemic obedience, internalized fear, and invisible hierarchy. Every act, every glance, every silence was a lesson in domination, and for those who understand, it illuminates the machinery controlling almost every system you will ever encounter. Now we confront the invisible currents that made this tragedy not only possible, but inevitable. The wedding was grotesque, but the true horror lay beneath the surface, in the invisible architecture of control. The bride's body was a tool, yes, but her mastery was psychological. Every gesture, every pause, every glance transmitted authority. The enslaved man became an instrument of compliance, and the townspeople, through silence and shock, amplified the system without realizing it. Each observer became a transmitter, reinforcing hierarchy and fear, converting brutality into a lesson in obedience. The enslaved man's mind had already surrendered long before the act. Decades of conditioning, social reinforcement, and internalized hierarchy ensured that resistance was impossible. He was not only physically bound but mentally imprisoned. Fear, expectation, and inevitability had become instinct, So when the bride's weight descended, compliance was complete. This is the terrifying truth of invisible domination. Obedience can be cultivated long before the first visible act of cruelty occurs, and systems thrive because fear is internalized and hierarchy appears absolute. The townspeople, unwitting participants, were essential to the process. Their reactions, shock, silence, whispers, magnified the bride's authority, turning her grotesque display into systemic proof of power. Authority does not need to shout when perception is aligned with expectation. Power endures when compliance is instinctive, and domination is reinforced by every observer who believes they are merely witnessing. The system becomes self-sustaining, silent, and nearly unstoppable. And here's the forbidden knowledge: these principles operate everywhere. Corporations, governments, institutions, families, and social groups all exploit invisible levers of control. Compliance is cultivated before it is demanded. Fear is embedded before it is expressed. Authority is amplified by perception, expectation, and collective reinforcement. Those who understand these levers gain insight, influence, and potential mastery over hierarchies invisible to most. Ignorance ensures subjugation, awareness is liberation, and a dangerous burden. The wedding was more than horror. It was instruction. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, revealing the architecture of systemic mastery, internalized obedience, and the terrifying power of collective complicity. Every glance, every whisper, every silent gasp became a lesson in domination. For those willing to see, this blueprint illuminates the invisible levers governing nearly every system of power you will ever encounter. Awareness changes everything. Once observed, the machinery cannot be unseen. Now, we descend into the final layers of invisible domination. The bride, grotesque and deliberate, was a living instrument of systemic control. Her act, amplified by the town's collective perception, demonstrates how obedience is cultivated, reinforced, and normalized. The enslaved man's body was the visible endpoint of a process that began decades earlier: conditioning, expectation, and internalized fear. Resistance had been rendered impossible long before the wedding, proving the efficiency of invisible power. Observe carefully. Domination is most potent when it operates through minds rather than bodies. Fear, perception, expectation, and collective complicity do far more work than whips or chains ever could. The townspeople were silent enforcers, amplifying authority without realizing it. Their shock and whispers ensured that the grotesque act became a system lesson, proving hierarchy is absolute, compliance is inevitable, and rebellion is unthinkable. This is the real mastery of invisible power. The oppressed enforce their own subjugation. The bride's understanding of psychology, social expectation, and perception made her grotesque form secondary to her effectiveness. Every deliberate gesture, every pause, every amplified movement exploited invisible levers to ensure dominance. This is why spectacle is crucial. Perception aligns with expectation, fear is internalized, and compliance becomes instinctive. Systems of authority thrive when domination appears effortless and resistance impossible. Here is the forbidden truth: the same mechanisms exist in modern hierarchies. Corporations, governments, social institutions, all exploit expectation, perception, fear, and complicity to enforce obedience. Knowledge of these levers is dangerous because it exposes both vulnerability and opportunity. Those who understand them gain invisible power. Those who ignore them remain trapped. Once you perceive the system, nothing appears accidental, and every interaction becomes a lesson in control. The wedding was a grotesque, brutal blueprint, but also a lesson in systemic mastery. The enslaved man's death was both literal and symbolic, a demonstration of internalized obedience, social reinforcement, and invisible hierarchy. For those who see, this reveals the machinery behind nearly every system of power, forever changing perception, understanding, and the way one navigates the world.